holy staves. And it was during that time where Luther said, I don't think this is doing any good. What's going on here? And he started thinking about salvation by grace through faith. He wasn't the only guy, but he was the main guy of the Reformation. And so in the Reformation in 1517, rooted in Germany and in Switzerland is where it kind of started. So we'll get to England here in a little bit. But what's interesting in history is right after the Reformation started, like 1531, the Reformation started losing its momentum. And a lot of things happened during that time. First of all, anytime you get people involved in something, it gets messy. And so even in the Reformation at the time, there were like splits. There were the Lutherans. There were the Reformed. We'll talk about them in a minute. Well, there were the radicals. There's always a zealot group, a radical group that wants to overtake governments and do different things. So you had those three things happening. There were conflicts in the churches. By the way, the Catholics were burning the books at this time, so no one was getting an idea. What do we really believe? What's the Reformation theology? And the first Reformation, the Lutheran martyrs in 1523 were burned at the stake, and that was, I've done some research on burning at the stake. That was just the worst death you could imagine. They tied you to a stake with chains. They lit a fire beneath you, and if they were merciful, they put gunpowder on your neck so that you would blow up before you had to go through all the pain of that. So a lot of things going on there. And then in 1524 and 1525, in that time, I think we heard a couple times on the bus the Peasants' Revolt. Did you guys hear that? Yeah. There were at the chapel, that guy put down the king, the picture of the king, put down the Peasants' Revolt. Well, there were a bunch of those. But in 1524 and 25, there was a big one, and they were using Lutheran as their calling card. So when the nobles would go against the peasants, they would yell out Luther, Luther. Because just think about it, no one had, for 1,000 years, no one had ever bucked the Catholic Church. Now someone did. So this kind of opened up a spirit of revolt. And so they started using him as their leader in the peasant revolt. And again, the peasants were poor and in poverty, and through history there have been a bunch of peasant revolts. So Luther first blamed the nobles, for putting them down. Then he blamed the peasants. The peasants destroyed 52 monasteries during that time and 270 castles. So they were just wreaking havoc across the land. In May of 1525, Luther wrote a tract against the peasants. The name of the tract was Against the Robbery and Murdering Hordes of the Peasants. And he said, he exhorted the princes to put it down. And 100,000 peasants were killed. And you just think about that. So you can imagine Luther now is not the most popular guy. And Lutheranism begins to lose its widespread movement. The nobles become back in power. They kind of take over Lutheranism, and so you got a lot of stuff going on there. A guy named Erasmus, who stayed as a Catholic, he rejected Luther. If you're familiar with Luther, he wrote tremendous writer, prolific writer. And Erasmus wrote The Freedom of the Will. And then a year later, Luther wrote one of his amazing books, Bondage of the Will. And the whole thing was around, we're jumping around a little bit, but the whole thing goes back to 300s. Augustine was this great thinker, and he said, fallen humanity is hopelessly bound to sin, and it's only by God's sovereign grace that our hearts can be awakened to trust in Christ. So when you study history, it all goes back to who believed in Augustinian theology and who didn't believe in Augustinian theology. So you got that going on. And then the next major player is John Calvin. And so Calvin picks up where kind of Luther leaves off. He was going to be a lawyer. He gets called into ministry, and at that time the French were persecuting Christians. They were burning Christians at the stake, and so Calvin wrote to the king of France, and he wrote when he was 26 years old. He wrote his first part of the Institutes of Christian Religion. Anyone heard of that? Calvin's Institutes. There are 4 parts to it. The first part is knowledge of God the Creator, and then knowledge of God the Redeemer in Christ, and then the way we receive grace, and then the church, the external needs, the community. And he added to that throughout his life. So now that thing is on my shelf is like that thick. I was on a board meeting with the seminary. He used to be the seminary president of Dallas Seminary, and he said he just retired. He said he just read through Calvin's Institutes in my daily devotions. I wouldn't do that, but he did. But now that's about 1,500 pages long. But he just kept adding to it, and from that we get what's called Calvinism, and I'll go over the 5 points of Calvinism. And then we'll talk about Arminianism and how those are the 2 major branches of theology we still have today. All right. So from Calvin's writing and his institutes, you have what are called the 5 points of Calvinism. And I got a place in your books if you want to write that or not. We'll get it to you. But when you think of Calvinism, think of TULIP, the acronym TULIP, and the T is total depravity. So that goes back to Augustine, right? We're hopeless before God unless God opens our heart. No one seeks God, no, not one. Romans. Total depravity. The U in TULIP is unconditional election. So God calls us to himself, and it's unconditional. It's not based on anything we've ever done. That's going to be important here in a second when we look at Arminius. Unconditional election, limited atonement. That means Christ only died for the elect, only died for those who are going to trust him, believers. That's the L. The I is irresistible grace. When God calls us to himself, he's going to call us. We can't resist it. And perseverance of the saints. That's what we would call eternal security. The saints continue. If you're a believer, you continue to persevere into the saints. Packer says the better word would be preservation of the saints. God preserves us. All right. So now, having said that, Calvinism, there are like layers and layers and layers. There are people who the first question they'll ask you, "Are you a Calvinist?" Before are you a Christian? And there are others who just hold to this theology. So at the Bible Chapel, personally, I would hold to all of those except for limited atonement. Limited atonement means that Christ just died for the elect. We hold to unlimited atonement, which means that Christ died for everyone. And in the Council of Dort, they say it best. Council of Dort would have been in the 1500s. Christ's death is sufficient for all, efficient for the elect, for those who trust. That makes sense? So Christ died for everyone, but it works efficiently for those who trust in him, and we believe those he calls to himself. All right, so that's Calvinism. Now there's this guy named Jacobus Arminius, and he lived from 1560 to 1609. His father died when he was young. His mother and sister were killed in a Spanish invasion, and he was brought up by this guy who was pretty wealthy and sent him to schools. He was ordained as a Dutch Reformed in the Dutch Reformed Church in 1587. But he began, just like Luther began to doubt Catholicism, he began to doubt Calvinism, the so Calvinism is called the Reformed faith. And again, there are a lot of layers to that, but just to keep it high level, Reformed faith. So he starts doubting Calvinism, and he comes up with what's called the Arminian theology, not Armenian, the nationality, but Arminian. He had a lot of debates with people. He actually died in 1609 of tuberculosis, but another guy named Gamarius took his works and instituted what's called Arminianism. And so here's the 5 points of Arminianism, right? So you got Calvinism. So whatever the points of Calvinism are, Arminian are it's the other side of it. So conditional election. God looks down through the tunnel of time, and he sees John is a good guy, president of Word of Life Panama, and likes that title a lot. And it's great when I'm talking and you can't. Okay, our wives are going to say that's too much already. He looks down the tunnel of time and sees a person, right, and says, "Great guy, I want him on my team." Right? That's conditional election. And then second is unlimited atonement, which we would hold to. Third is free will. So man has the ability to choose God or not choose God. Now Calvin would say we're totally depraved, so how can we even do that, right? God's got to work in our heart. But he says, no, we have free will. So they play with that a little bit. They say that God like partially works in our heart. There's kind of a human cooperation in salvation. That's what they say. So it's God, but it's also man, right? Resistible grace. If God says, I looks down and says, I want you on my team, you could say, no, don't want to be on the team. And then you falling from grace. You can lose your salvation. That make sense? So on one hand, you have very much, this is God's sovereignty, Calvinism. And on the other hand, you have very much man kind of makes all the decisions and keeps it. So in Arminianism, you could say, I'm a believer today, but I don't want to be, I can walk away from the faith. In Calvinism, it says, God's going to keep you. You may stray away, like David in the Old Testament, but God's going to bring you back. That make sense? All right, so that comes into play now when we get to John Wesley. If you've got this book and you read some of it, Wesley, his mother was, by the way, his mother was amazing. We can't get to her grave. She was one of 25 children, and she married this guy Samuel, and he was a sluggard for all practical. He was a priest. She has all these kids, and they have an argument, a minor argument, and he just left her for a year. He just takes off. And there's letters that she wrote to him begging him to come back. She basically raised the kids. He spent all their money. He was in prison a couple times, debtor's prison. He spent all their money and all of his time writing a commentary on the book of Job, which was never published and no one ever knows about it. On the other hand, she's called the mother of Methodism. So she was an amazing woman. So John Wesley, one of her sons, Charles Wesley, the writer of 6,000 hymns. John Wesley comes and they go to Oxford. We'll talk more about this at Oxford. They start what's called a Holy Club. The Holy Club's very disciplined in what they do. And George Whitefield is a part of that. We'll talk about him in a second. So John Wesley goes into ministry. He goes to Savannah, Georgia, and on the way there, he runs into a group called the Moravians. The Moravians, three things about the Moravians. They were very Christ-centered. They believed in the unity of all people. So they would overlook doctrinal things for unity. and they believed in the priesthood of all believers. So at that time, when there were ordained priests and only they could do the sacraments, Moravians said priesthood of all believers. On the way there, they asked John Wesley, "Are you a believer?" And he said, "Of course I am. I'm a pastor." But he said later, "I really wasn't. My confession was in vain." And so he goes to the States. He falls in love with this girl. She rejects him, so he has that. In Savannah, Georgia, they don't like the Holy Club, and so they basically send him back. And he goes back to England, and so now he's like, his faith is shaken a little bit. And I got a quote from him. He goes to a church. We can't get there because the road's closed, but it's Aldersgate, where he goes. God just leads him there. And he says, "In the evening, I went very unwillingly to a society at Aldersgate Street, where one was reading Luther's preface." Just think about how this goes all the way back to Luther impacting these guys. Luther's preface to the Epistle of the Romans. About 9:15, while he was describing the change which God works in the hearts through faith in Christ, I felt my heart strangely warm. When you read about John Wesley, you always hear that. His heart was strangely warmed. I felt I did trust in Christ alone for salvation, and an assurance was given me that he had taken away my sins, even mine, and saved me from the law of sin and death. So it's at Aldersgate that he truly trusted in Christ. And an amazing story. Now, he holds to Arminian theology. Another guy in the Holy Club was George Whitefield, and George Whitefield held to Calvinistic theology. But a great revival was going on during that time. They were both in the Holy Club. They knew each other. And so Whitefield convinced John Wesley to come and help him. And Wesley didn't want to at first because he didn't like, Whitefield was a dramatic preacher. We'll talk more about him when we get to Oxford. But he had a great relationship with Benjamin Franklin because he was in the States a lot. And Wesley didn't like him being so dramatic. Remember, Wesley, he liked Methodists. That's where that comes from. He liked the methods and order, the Holy Club, disciplines. And he and Whitefield were together for a while, and he started bringing order to Whitefield's services. But they had different theologies, Arminian and Calvinist, and so they split ways because of that. So the Methodist Church today would be Arminian, holding to the beliefs of Jacob Arminius. Presbyterian, we'll get to Scotland, but Calvin really held to the Presbyterian government, church government, and the presbyteros, the elders, and so that became the Presbyterian. So just think about Methodist because of John Wesley's methods, and Presbyterian because of Calvin's holding to elder government in the church. So amazing what happened, but again, you got to think about it. A lot of Calvinists were so against the Arminians and Arminians against the Calvinists that there were so many splits in church history there. And so one person asked George Whitefield, "Will John Wesley even be in heaven? Will John Wesley be in heaven?" And Whitefield said, "Yeah, but he'll be so far ahead of me in line, I won't even be able to see him." So they had a great love for each other as they worked through that. All right. So many things to talk about, but I just wanted to get those Arminian and Calvinism because that's going to be critical as we go through this, as we go here with Wesley, Arminian, as we go. We get to Scotland and very much Calvinistic and Presbyterian. So John Calvin, Luther, Calvin, and then of course Wesley with all the things going on here. Next time we'll talk about the 5 solas of the Reformation, and then we'll base our devos on that as we go through. All right.